You are listening to the Visualizing War and Peace podcast. With the help of a wide range of guests, we examine how war and peace are experienced in different periods and places, and we discuss the world-building impact which representations of conflict and its aftermath can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Zofia Guertin, and I'm a doctoral student in Classics and Ancient History at the University of St. Andrews. Over the past few years, I've been working behind the scenes on this podcast as a sound editing mixer, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing the fantastic Dr. Alice König, director of the Visualizing War and Peace project here at the University of St. Andrews. As part of her research on ancient conflict narratives, Alice has become interested in how war's aftermath, conflict resolution, peace building, and peace itself were understood and experienced in different cultures and communities across antiquity. Today, Alice and I will be discussing a new publication coming out soon, a multi-author volume on visualizing war and antiquity, co-edited with Dr. Nicolas Wiater, and we're going to discuss some of the aspects of the book and some of the themes that they're going to touch on, as well as giving us an opportunity today to dig into some of your research on ancient discourses of both war and peace. So big welcome today, Alice. Welcome to your podcast.
Thank you very much. It's exciting to be on the other side of the microphone.
Just to jump right into it, the Visualizing War and Peace project has allowed you to connect to so many different interesting scholars and artists and creatives engaging with the ancient world. And your new volume being published with Routledge coming out any week now, which is terribly exciting. What is the focus of this volume?
Thank you. So this volume that's coming out, as you say, very soon, co-edited with Nicolas Wiater, is called Visualizing War Across the Ancient Mediterranean, Interplay Between Conflict Narratives in Different Media and Genre. And it has two main goals, really. The first is to explore the concept of visualization itself. So in our book, Visualizing War it's about much more than looking at or depicting war. When we visualize something, we picture it, we imagine it, we might even represent it to other people. So, for example, soldiers often visualize the next combat operation while they're waiting for orders, or news reports help people at home visualize the impacts of war on civilians, or artists and filmmakers depict real and fictional conflicts to help their audiences visualize them. So some forms of visualization do definitely involve picturing reality, how things really are or have really been. But visualization can also be an act of imagination. It's a creative activity. You know, when we visualize, we conjure probable or possible images up, either for ourselves or for others, and we're picturing things that we can't literally see. So for us, visualizing war involves more than simply seeing or representing it. It's about generating images and ideas and understandings and, in fact, expectations of war, which then inform and don't just reflect the world around us. And we really want to focus attention with this book on how depictions of war actually envision it into both new and old ways of being. So how depictions of war in ancient epic poetry, for example, envision heroism or violence, let's say, in ways that affect real world mindsets and behaviours. And it might be worth just giving you a really quick example from an ancient text of what we really mean by visualising, because this is not a new concept. In fact, the Roman author Silius Italicus really understood the visualising power of narratives 2,000 years ago. So he wrote a poem about the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. And very early on in that poem, the goddess Juno inspires the Carthaginian leader Hannibal in a dream. And in his dreams, then Hannibal sees himself storming the capital and managing to get across the Alps, and imagines that he's going to have very successful battles, and he, envisions the landscape covered in Roman blood and so on. And what we hear in the poem is that Hannibal's servants hear him, in his dream, uttering a sort of piercing cry. And the servants, understand that his dreams that drench him in sweat are actually what's called sort of insubstantial warfare, inania bella, wars that aren't actually real or substantial. So Hannibal's servants and Silius's readers know that the visions that Hannibal conjures are false dreams. Juno is giving him false dreams to inspire him to action. They're pictures that Hannibal would like to see come true. They're imagined actions that he's visualizing, that he wants to enact for real. And these visions, these visualizations determine his future behavior. They commit him to conflict. They commit him to violence. And that's what Juno intends with this. So through visualization, through a dream in this case, she, Juno, and Silius Italicus, the author, get us to understand the power of visualization that can really change the course of action of an individual, with ramifications for all the people who get caught up in the conflict that follows. So that's a long way of saying that our book is about the visualizing power, the envisioning nature of storytelling, war storytelling. And then there's one other goal in the book, which is to explore interplay between ancient representations of conflict and intertextuality. But we might come on to that in a bit.
Perfect. That's an excellent example and a really interesting one, as well as how the impact of the dream scenario as it's being transmitted to him is radiating out and impacting his men around him too. That's such an interesting secondary layer of how the visualization is working. So it sounds fascinating.
I think the point we kind of want to get across is that visualization is really dynamic, it's generative, but it can be mind altering and behavior shaping, and with these real world impacts. Because, of course, although it's an epic poem, Silius's Punica is in some ways quite mythologized. It's also about real world events, history that actually happened. People actually died in these conflicts.
Absolutely. Well, and it covers a long period of time from between the 9th century BCE to the 6th century CE. It's quite an ambitious scope and multiple ancient cultures with a wide range of representations of ancient warfare. Can you give us a flavor of a couple of the chapters to whet our appetites for this?
Yeah, as you say, the book takes us from very early on in ancient Near Eastern history all the way through to late antiquity and to actual conflict between early Christian and pagan conflict narratives. So interplay, that's where different authors from different cultures in late antiquity are actually competitively pitting their conflict narratives against each other. So one really early chapter in the book by John Hyland looks at the Bisotun monument that was carved into Mount Bisotun in modern-day Iran, celebrating Darius I's achievements both as a ruler and as a military victor. And the monument has a sculptural relief and then some corresponding inscriptions in 3 different languages, Elamite, Babylonian and Old Persian. John Hyland is really interested in the interplay between the textual and visual forms of war storytelling on the monument, but also in the way in which they interact with a wider culture of war storytelling in the era around them. So he looks at the way in which they repurpose traditional war storytelling elements found in Old Akkadian and Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions, and also in the way in which Darius's scribes might have actually been influenced by the sort of non-official genre of Babylonian chronicle writing. So he's really interested in the way in which different traditions, very top-down, highly political charged royal inscriptions and much more informal writing about past conflicts might all have fed into the representation of war on the Bisotun monument. And he's really interested in the intersection between narratives of war and narratives of power, and as part of that thinks about the connections that the monument makes between military victory and divine support. And that's something that's picked up in a few other chapters in the book as well. We've got a chapter about halfway through by Courtney Roby that looks at some ancient Greek military manuals. And she's really interested in the ways in which they try to impose order on the real chaos of battle. So there are authors like Asclepiodotus and Aelianus Tacticus who present really highly formalized ideas and depictions and visualizations of how battle should work, sometimes with diagrams that help with this sort of sense of abstraction and simplification. It's all very reductive, and she likens it to a spherical cow. When we draw a cow, we often draw a sort of circle with a little face and sticky legs, and we know it's a cow, even though cows aren't actually round. And so she thinks about these military manuals that are reductive, that simplify, that abstract the realities of conflict, but they do so in ways that link it to discourses of geometry and science and precision, and really lend their representations authority that way. She's interested in these manuals which visualize war for real war fighting, right? They're meant to teach you how to do it in the real world, but they do it by visualizing ideals that are actually very hard to map onto reality. And that gap between reality and representation, reality and truth or idealization comes through in lots of other chapters. We've got a chapter by John Hesk, for example, looking at the fog of war trope in ancient Greek drama. There's a chapter by Zara Newby that looks at the use of scenes from the Trojan War stories on much, much later Roman era funeral sarcophagi and funeral wear generally. So thinking about how those narratives influenced funeral practice, even when someone being buried wasn't necessarily a military person. And then we've got a chapter, for example, by Hannah Marie Chidwick, who looks at the Roman poet Lucan and his tendency to visualize the brutality of war through dismembered bodies and brutalized landscapes. So that gives you a little flavor. There's a lot in the book, lots of different chapters, really covering different genres: panegyric, poetry, historiography, but also art, documents, technical writing, buildings, and so on. There's something for everyone in the book.
That's excellent. And I appreciate the wide geographic spread too that's being covered by it, because there's so much ripple effect of influence that happens in the ancient world as much as now. So it's great that there's all these connections being made too.
There's a chapter that dives deep into books from the Hebrew Bible, and as well as some of this sort of Neo-Assyrian culture, as I say, all the way through to some early Christian texts as well.
So that's excellent. And in this volume's introduction, you underline how omnipresent narratives of war in Greek and Roman antiquity were. Can you say a bit more about that? How saturated in war storytelling were different ancient societies, and what kinds of war storytelling dominated these stories?
Thank you. I think that's a really important question. And I suppose I want to start by just saying that we should look around us in the modern world as well and understand how incredibly saturated modern societies are in war storytelling. It's not just a feature of Greco-Roman antiquity. But let's take an example from Greco-Roman antiquity by just zooming ourselves into the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars in Rome in the Augustan era, for example, let's say. So if you were walking through the Campus Martius during the reign of Augustus, you'd come across a load of really old temples, some of which had fallen down, some of which were being restored, that for centuries had been vowed by generals during the heat of battle in the hope of getting a successful outcome, for example, or had been dedicated on triumphal return. This place, the Campus Martius, was a place where also traditionally the Roman army mustered to set out for war, where lots of rites of war and rituals connected to the declaring of war were performed. And then it's also the place where triumphs, if a Roman general had been successful, would have started out from. You would process in triumph from the Campus Martius into the city of Rome. And one of the consequences of that is that some of these temples vowed by generals are then replete with spoils of war, with plunder. And there are other buildings. By the time we get to the Augustan period, there are buildings that are being financed by plunder from war. So, for example, the General Pompey built a massive theatre, which was very much a vanity project, very much a celebration of himself. At the inauguration of this theatre, we understand that there was almost a replay of one of his triumphal processions, or as well as the actual plays being put on. The theatre had the sculptural representations of the 14 nations that he had helped conquer, and he dedicated the whole complex to Venus Victrix, all-conquering Venus, his patron deity, or one of them. Not far off from Pompey's theatre, you'd come across Augustus's mausoleum. Outside the walls of that, outside the doors, inscribed on bronze tablets probably, was Augustus's sort of autobiography, his retrospective deeds done, the res gestae. And on that, he lists lots of civilian achievements, lots of good governance, but also a whole string of military activities. He's very much a conquering emperor, an emperor who absolutely wields the sword. And if you're wafting around the Campus Martius and you feel hungry, you might reach into your pocket and get some coins out. And 10 to 1 or two of them might actually have, a proclamation of victory or representation of pax peace on them. So just that little snapshot of Augustan era Rome gives you a sense that all around you, in the physical fabric of the city, in the coins in your pocket, there are representations of war, and they're representations of war that are very top-down elite narratives, right? They're the representations that generals, that commanders, that emperors have the finance and the power to put out there. Now, in the city, there would also be war veterans, there would be widows, there would be a lot of people who've been enslaved by conquest, but their stories aren't the ones that dominate. Their stories aren't the ones that make their way into the poetry of the period, into the plays of the period. Well, that's not quite true, actually. Some, 1 or 2 Roman era plays actually do represent people who've been enslaved or displaced by war. But on the whole, the narratives that are in the literature of the era and in the physical fabric of the city are narratives that give us a very elite, macro-political, celebratory, colonizing, imperialistic view of warfare.
That's fascinating, and a really wonderful visualization of just what you can see as you're walking around and how that might have impacted a viewer. So, what kinds of peace storytelling do we know about in ancient Greece and Rome? Who was doing it? Was it being done?
Yeah, so not a great deal. But if we go back to Augustus's Res Gestae, that gives us a good flavour of the kind of peace storytelling that's particularly prevalent in Roman society and other parts of antiquity. What we see there is very much peace as pacification of other people, peace actually as violence, peace as subjugation of other people, as colonization. So the images of peace, when Augustus declares that he has brought peace, he's closed the gates of Janus for only the third time in their history, the gates that, when opened show that Rome is in a state of war, when closed it's in a state of peace. The claims that Augustus makes to have brought an era of peace, an era of pax, the Pax Augusta, the Pax Romana. He's talking there very much about a perpetrator's kind of peace, a victor's peace, a peace that is in the interests of the Roman state, not actually all people who live within it, and certainly not in the interests of people at the fringes of the Roman Empire who are constantly under threat of further violence, ongoing violence, not in the interests of all the people who've been displaced, who've been enslaved, who've lost livelihoods, who've lost family. So peace is visualized very much as the spoils of war and as an end game, but it's still somehow an ongoing violent undertaking, because to keep peace, you have to keep enforcing it. And so we see in, for example, Virgil's Aeneid, there's an extraordinary image of this moment in effect where Augustus has brought peace to the Roman world, where we see war caged in iron bars, and war is in this cage, growling, snarling, with a bloodied face, kind of raging to get out. And I think that's a really good encapsulation of the way in which, in a lot of peace storytelling or representations of peace in the Roman world, peace is understood as almost a temporary phenomenon. It's a ceasefire, it's a negative peace, it's the absence of conflict for Rome. And always terrifies me about that image in Virgil's Aeneid is this sense that war's going to get out. And when it does, my goodness, it's going to be brutal and bloody. So yes, we do see images of war's aftermath getting touched on in epic storytelling, in historiography. But it's touched on much more as a footnote to provide pathos. It's not explored in any sort of deep way. And one example of this from the Greek world is in Homer's Iliad, right at the end in book 24. There's a very famous scene, which actually one of our authors, Zara Newby, talks about in her chapter on the Roman sarcophagi. It's the scene where Hector's body is returned to Priam. And it's a scene where Achilles and Priam meet. Priam comes to Achilles' camp to petition him for the body of his son. And there's this sort of pocket of peace in the poem, a temporary ceasefire. And in that temporary ceasefire, Achilles and Priam talk to each other. And Achilles starts lamenting the fact that he's being caught up in this war. And he becomes this victim almost, not a perpetrator of violence. And although Achilles briefly softens towards Priam, always there is this threat that Achilles is on the verge of more violence. Priam is warned by a god at one point to leave the camp soon because Achilles' anger is on a knife edge. And as the Iliad ends, Hector's body is returned. His widow Andromache laments the effects on her. There's a lot of mourning, but it's always mourning with a view the funeral, has to be hurried through because the violence, the war is about to start up again. So there we see, again, a temporary ceasefire, a pocket of peace. And it's actually, I find that narrative a very problematic one, because that moment where we glimpse Achilles at peace humanizes him. He stops being the warrior briefly. He becomes this human who's on a par with Priam, who's a victim, not just a perpetrator. But he is also a perpetrator. He is also a warrior. And I would argue, and I have argued that in the book that's coming out, that the glimpse of Achilles at peace is as militarizing as much of the rest of the text, because it makes us like the warrior. It makes us empathize with the warrior. It makes us understand the warrior. And that's a very dangerous thing, because the next time he goes into his acts of violence, we're going to have more sympathy with him than we did before. So some of those moments, some of those narratives of pockets of peace are actually really militarizing in themselves. They're moments where, as I say, we're made to empathize with the perpetrators of conflict.
That's excellent. That is a really poignant example. Why do you think narratives of peace are so vastly outnumbered by narratives of war in antiquity? What do you think accounts for that?
I mean, I think it's partly because of the social and cultural function that storytelling has long played in human societies. And that function, that social cultural function, has always partly to explain and process crisis, but also to celebrate extraordinary achievements. In the book, one of the things that I do dive into a little bit is the psychology of storytelling. There's some really good psychological research out there which underlines that we are innately drawn to negative information, to information about danger. So it's because it's an evolutionary feature of the oldest bits of our brains. We, for a very long time, had to be quite alert to the possibility that there was a saber-toothed tiger out there, or whatever it might be, that was going to get us, right? So we are really alert. Our antennae are out for bad stories, negative stuff, danger, threat. So we find that intrinsically exciting. But not only that, what the psychology research shows is that when we hear dangerous information, when we hear negative, bad information, we process it more deeply and we remember it for longer. And that over time than sort of nice information or happy stuff. It goes really deep. And it means that we're actually sort of constantly attuned to it. And some people would argue that that's one reason why we are very deeply attracted to storytelling that always builds to a crisis and then ends up resolving and there being a happy ending. But we don't actually spend a lot of time on that happy ending. We tend to narrate the crisis, the drama, the peril at much greater length because we find that narratively satisfying. There are plenty of war stories, of course, that do end with, a victory, a triumph, a win, a success. But the really complex peace storytelling that sort of dives deep into the long, slow process of post-conflict recovery, that doesn't have so much peril. It doesn't have so many clear-cut heroes. And we are just less attracted to it. It sells less. So that's one sort of broad explanation. But another explanation that follows on from that, in a way, is that what we can see from our ancient sources is that the storytelling habits about war are deeply, deeply ingrained. There's a play by Aristophanes called Peace, and it's actually set at a point where Athens is about to sign a real-life peace treaty, the Peace of Nicaea, which doesn't end up lasting very long, but it's a play that's written in the context of recent experiences of war in Athens. And at the end of the play, peace has been freed from war's bonds and peace is personified, and there's going to be a double celebration, a wedding and the celebration of the arrival of peace. And as the celebrations are getting underway, some boys come along and start singing, and they start singing songs about war. They start actually almost quoting Homer's Iliad. They quote Homeric style verses. And one of the characters in the play, Tregeas, says, "Stop it, stop singing that kind of war nonsense. Come on, sing something nice, sing about peace." And the boys can't, they don't. They keep these war stories, these lines of war song keep tripping off their lips, and he gets very frustrated. And in lots of ways, it's just a moment of comedy, but it's also a moment that's deeply revealing. It reveals that children in Athens are so deeply immersed in war storytelling that that is what they default to singing. And it's really hard to pivot them from that. That's the storytelling that's got traction from childhood. And it's a really interesting moment at the end of the play, where the play is in theory a peace story, but the next generation are coming in and disrupting it with these war verses, with these martial verses. And our attention is drawn to how disruptive and problematic that is by one of the internal characters in the play. And bear in mind, this is a play that's going to be watched by a bunch of people who will recognize the kinds of verses that these boys are singing and know that they're ingrained in their heads as well. So that play there just reminds us how deeply embedded in our psyche from childhood war storytelling is, and how difficult it is to pivot to songs of peace.
Absolutely. That's a good example. Thank you. Just to pivot now to the Visualizing War and Peace project, it's interested in this feedback loop between narrative and reality and the impact that our war and peace storytelling has on the real world. And in this book's introduction, you discuss in particular the militarizing impacts of ancient habits of visualizing war and peace. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so I think it's probably worth just thinking about militarization broadly, first of all. And I've been learning a lot from some amazing theorists on militarization. In its simplest sense, militarization is a process by which individuals and groups, and sometimes whole societies, communities, are persuaded or end up thinking that violent solutions are valid, are sometimes even desirable, are at least acceptable, and sometimes even desirable. So a militarized society is a society where it's generally acceptable that military solutions to a problem, to a political problem, are okay, that we'll finance them, that we will gladly pay our taxes towards a military solution, that we'll perhaps, if we're MPs or whatever, that we'll vote for it. And as Cynthia Enloe, an amazing scholar who's worked on militarization a lot, underlines, most of the people in the world who are militarized are not themselves in uniform. I'm quoting her there. Most militarized people are civilians. Militarization only works because it's not a niche thing. It's not only the people who wear uniforms who support conflict as a political solution to challenging contexts. So militarism is an ideology that accepts the use of violence, the use of force, as a viable, acceptable, sometimes even desirable solution. I've already given you a couple of examples of the way in which some of the war storytelling that we get from antiquity, and indeed the peace storytelling that we get from antiquity, is replete with militarisms and is deeply militarizing itself. So Augustus's raised gestae, which we've talked about already, is an example. It's replete with very highly militarized understandings of peace, and it is in itself militarizing because it teaches us that violence is a perfectly acceptable avenue towards peace, and that peace, in fact, is tightly bound up with ongoing perpetration of violence. If you want another example, Livy's History of Rome, for example, the first book of Livy's History of Rome sets out the very origins of the city. And that repeatedly, over episode after episode after episode, reflects and reinforces some deep assumptions that resorting to armed violence, that the use of military aggression is regularly the best solution to political differences between neighbouring states, for example. One of the things that it also does in episode after episode involves some commander or another deciding that actually, yes, we do need to go to war with these other people. Or sometimes the emerging Roman state starts to become less disciplined itself. And so what Rome needs to seek is an external war in order to sort of drive a kind of internal moral discipline. That's a very militarizing idea. And all of these militarisms within the first book of Livy's History of Rome, and many, many other texts and many other books of that particular text, these militarisms not only reinforce ideas about war being valid, acceptable, but actually underline the idea that war can be very, very good for a society. And they also underline abiding assumptions about how you behave in conflict, how you treat prisoners, for example, how you treat women during a conflict. And Livy's History of Rome, the first book, and much of the rest of it, really gives us this strong sense that Rome can only grow through war, and that Rome's success depends on constant conquering, constant expansion, constant putting down of other neighbours, the sacking of another city here, or the displacement of a load of people there, all the plunder that goes with that as well. Rome's success absolutely depends on war, and that is militarism in a nutshell.
Thank you very much. That's fabulous. So besides militarization, what are the other real-world consequences that might ancient habits of war and peace storytelling have had on people's lives? Like, how else can we see this?
So if we stick with Livy's first book, Livy's book one from his History of Rome, we can think of a concrete example. In that book, Livy tells the story of the rape of the Sabine women. So the story is that Romulus and his little merry band of men were doing fine. They were gradually building up the city of Rome, but they lacked women in order to produce the next generation. So they sent invitations to the people of the neighbouring city, the Sabines, to come to some games, to celebrate something together. And the plot was that during these games, during this sacred festival, the Romans, Romulus's people, would snatch the maidens, the young girls of the Sabines, and take them off and make them their wives. And then obviously there was a war between the Romans and the Sabines, and eventually, as the story goes, the Sabine women who'd been kidnapped themselves entered the fray, put themselves between the Romans and their Sabine relatives and said, stop, don't fight on our account, it's breaking us apart, make peace. And so in a horrible twist of storytelling, Livy gives credit to the Sabine women for bringing peace and harmony to Rome. And the story's very famous, very well known. It's been repeated endlessly. And one of the things that happens when it's repeated endlessly is it is often referred to as the kidnap of the Sabine women. There are works of art that are the kidnap of the Sabine women rather than the rape of the Sabine women. And there is even some scholarship on this episode and on the narrative more generally that actually argues, well, should we call it the rape of the Sabine women? Were they actually raped? Would they have seen this as rape? Now, let's think of some modern analogies when women in modern contexts have been taken as war captives, have been forcibly abducted, have been sexually trafficked, have been forced into whether it's marriage or an even more exploitative relationship with their captors. We don't quibble about whether or not that is rape. So the journalist Christina Lamb writes about this in her book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefields. She writes about her astonishment at how late in the day rape was criminalized as a war crime, about the lack of visibility in journalism, in news reporting for rape as one of the impacts of war. She quotes women who have been raped in conflict saying there are monuments to the soldiers and so on, but where are the monuments to all the women? Where are our names? Why aren't our names spoken? Why aren't we remembered? And one of the things that Christine Lamb does talk about is she actually goes right back into ancient history. She goes back to texts like Deuteronomy, where, in fact, there is an argument made that it's absolutely reasonable and just and lawful in war to take captive women and make them your sex slaves, or make them your wives. But she also cites 21st century commanders of ISIS saying exactly the same thing, saying, we will conquer your Rome, we will take your women, we will destroy your cities. And she draws a direct line of connection between the ways in which war storytelling in the past that has euphemized, that has not problematized war rape in ancient stories. She draws a direct line of connection between that, and she cites Homer and she cites Thucydides and all sorts, and the ongoing perpetration of rape as a war crime today. The argument that she makes, and that in fact I make in a chapter in the book that's coming out, is that there are all sorts of ways in which war storytelling informs the real world and reflects our reality. You know, the stories that we tell about conflict in all sorts of ways don't just reflect reality, they shape our mindsets, they shape our behaviours. But this is just one example. If we continue, when we're classics scholars, when we're students, if we continue to translate Livy's rape of the Sabine women in euphemistic terms, if we follow Livy's lead and have these women excuse their captors, say that they're pleased with the solution, be celebrated as peacemakers, not as victims who have to live forever more with the trauma of what they've gone through. If we keep euphemizing what happened in that kind of story, we are setting up patterns of storytelling that facilitate that kind of behavior centuries on in the real world. So it's it's our duty as classicists, as readers of these kinds of war stories, not to euphemize. And astonishingly, when I was researching this chapter, I was looking at the verb rapio in Latin, which is used in Livy's text, and discovered that in the Oxford Latin Dictionary and in the Lewis and Short Dictionary and the online versions, that the verb rapio and words like raptus, having been snatched, seized and raped, are translated in very euphemistic ways in those dictionaries, in ways where the word rape is not in fact used, right? So a student coming to Livy and looking up that word, looking up that vocabulary is not pointed in that direction clearly enough. There are all sorts of euphemisms like seized with force, ravished, right? But not raped, okay? It's just one example of the real world consequences of not just ancient but ongoing habits of war storytelling.
Absolutely. And I'm very familiar with the story you pointed to. And as most listeners would be, images of the rape of the Sabines are so famous, particularly the one that comes to mind is Jean-Jacques David, the Enlightenment paint 1800s-ish painter. And the way that the women are placed as heroic features for their sacrifice and bridging the two cultures and all that sort of thing. It's not painted with tragedy at all. It's painted with heroism. And this is the kind of heroic woman you should be. Contemplate your role in the revolution, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's an excellent example to point to, and a really evocative story in terms of how we even just treat women in conflict stories from ancient history.
Yeah, and those women in Livy's narrative and in the painting you mentioned, they're represented from the perspective of the male dominant elite, right? The ones who win, the Romans,
Yes.
or the leaders who hope that these Sabine women will be an inspiration for other people. The women's stories, their actual experiences are not part of the storytelling at all. And appallingly, in Livy's text, they are given a voice, but they're given a voice that tells a story that serves Romulus's interests.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. So moving on to the contributions of your book, you talk about the impact that intertextuality or narrative interactions had on ancient war storytelling and its world-shaping effects. Could you explain this a bit?
Yeah, so as I said, one of the goals of the book is to dig deep into the idea of visualization and the way in which war stories envision and don't just depict conflict. But the other goal of the book is really to explore interplay between representations of conflict in lots of different genre and media. So, for example, the way that epic depictions of hand-to-hand fighting actually influenced ancient military manuals and then fed into actual military theory, or the ways in which representations of military defeat or victory on coins or public monuments interacted also with representations of victory in historical texts or in speeches, and together, through their interactions, formed shared ideas, shared discourses of what triumph looks like, or indeed how prisoners of war can be treated, and so on. So you can probably think of a range of individual war stories that have influenced how you look at conflict. And, it might be a particular historical account from World War I, or it might be an individual film like Saving Private Ryan or Hurt Locker or whatever. But the point that we want to make with our book is that their individual impact, the individual impact of sort of an isolated story, is nothing compared to the cumulative impact of all the interconnected war storytelling that saturates our environment through war memorials, poems, films, military metaphors, and their interaction with each other. Because as they interact, as war memorials and poems, for example, and films all sort of dialogue with each other, they really do, they firm up, they canonize shared ideas, shared norms of understanding about conflict and how we think about it. So a core argument of the book is that we can only understand the evolution of shared cultural discourses of war, of dominant war imaginaries, if we pay attention to how those discourses get formed and cemented by repetition, by referencing, by allusion, by interplay between lots of different war stories. And to give you a couple of examples of that, so thinking about a story that's not actually a war story, we could go, for example, to Ovid's poem, the Ars Amatoria, a didactic poem that supposedly teaches you how to get a girlfriend, or indeed his Amores, his collection of love poems. Regularly throughout both sets of work, Ovid borrows from and alludes to epic. So he'll bring in an epic hero, an Achilles or someone. He'll bring in an epic heroine, an Andromache or a Briseis. And through these allusions to these heroes, he manages actually to make violence towards women look acceptable, right? So there are moments in the Ars Amatoria and in the Amores where, for instance, he imagines telling a story about how he hit his girlfriend, and he imagines her parading before him in a triumphal procession as a captive. So he's using interplay with other narratives, with stories that we're used to out there of triumph, what triumph looks like, what captives look like, to inflect his own narrative, his own little elegy with a sort of deeper layer of meaning, and to write up his fight with his girlfriend as some kind of heroic epic battle. In the Ars Amatoria, he's quite explicit about the fact that you can be an Achilles and you can have your Briseis. In other words, you can have your sex-trafficked woman. Again, he uses intertextuality with epic to make some of the violence, to make sort of kidnap, to make rape, actually, literally to make rape seem heroic, and this ties into a sort of more general habit that the love elegists, the Latin love elegists have of writing up love as a form of military service, a form of military heroism. Like the soldier, you have to be awake all night and it's really hard work, and it involves triumphing over adversity and so on. Modern examples might include the way in which in the UK, in the toxic debates about refugees and asylum seekers, politicians repeatedly allude to prior invasions of the United Kingdom, like threats in the Second World War and so on, bringing in an intertext from another war story to try and give some impetus to their story and to make their story sound like a war story. sound like
Yeah.
we're repelling a threat. Or, for example, when Hamas attacked southern Israel on the 7th of October 2023, immediately one of the things that Israeli politicians and American politicians started to do was lean into stories about 9/11 to equate that situation with a well-known war story, effectively, and then to lean into all of the rhetoric about the war on terror. But in the meantime, following Israel's bombing of Gaza, lots of other people then started leaning into other narratives of conflict, including, in fact, the Holocaust, to say that what was going on in Gaza was another kind of Holocaust. And both sides have used the Holocaust as an equivalent to what happened to people in Israel, what happened to people in Gaza. So intertextuality, we do it all the time. We're very intertextual in our storytelling. But one of the things that we do when we're intertextual, when we're alluding to other narratives that are out there, other war stories, as we tell our war stories, is we're giving new authority to our war stories, but we're also really embedding long-term habits of thinking about just war, of thinking about acceptable levels of violence. So we use intertextuality a lot to kind of keep fine-tuning what the boundaries of war and terrorism, let's say, are, what kinds of violence are acceptable, what kinds of violence are not. So those are just a couple of examples from antiquity and modernity that really drive home the fact that intertextuality is something we do all the time, sort of this interplay between narratives, constantly tweaks, nuances, cements and amplifies certain habits of thinking about war.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has the stratigraphy effect where you can build up conflicts using historical precedents that you can shape different ways and get people on side or off side, or depending on how you're framing it, to things that they may not think about in ways that are traditionally meaningful to them. So that's a really interesting example. And as well as discussing intertextuality, when you write about interdiscursivity, what is that, and why should we pay attention to it when studying peace and war storytelling?
So interdiscursivity is a kind of macro form of intertextuality. So intertextuality is the sort of the interaction between individual narrative blocks, between one text and another, one war story and another. Interdiscursivity is the interplay that happens between discourses, between cultural discourses or shared cultural norms. So, for example, when we tell our war stories, quite often one of the things that we're doing is we're bringing in discourses of nationhood, not just individual stories about nationhood, but whole discourses of nationhood or discourses of justice, not just individual stories about just war or not just war. We bring in discourses of belonging, of otherness, and so on. So interdiscursivity is about the way in which individual narratives of conflict harness and leverage shared cultural discourses or shared cultural norms. And as they do that, what they manage to achieve is they connect their specific ideas about conflict with these normative ideas about other things, about broader things. So a war story that brings in discourses of masculinity connects that particular kind of envisioning or visualization of conflict with our assumptions about manliness or masculinity, or our assumptions about chaos and law and order. And so these repeated interactions between discourses then cement each other over time, and they establish quite a framework of interlocking ideas. And this framework of discourses, this framework of norms, is what structures and informs our sociocultural and political environments. So what we know or repeatedly say about war is often connected to and ends up depending on what we know and repeatedly say about gender or about citizenship or about leadership. So these dominant discourses, these discourses of leadership, discourses of gender, discourses of war, they repeatedly borrow from and buttress each other. And they do, as our war stories constantly bring in other discourses, it tightens the weave of a sort of a nexus of cultural norms that shapes all our real world interactions. A really obvious example might be the way in which discourses of power and discourses of war constantly intersect in our war stories. And as I said, John Hyland's chapter on the Bickerton Monument really dives into this in our book. One of the things that we really see there is that there's this double truth in that war makes kings and kings make war, right? And the discourses of power and war are really hard to disentangle. Now, what would it be like if we had discourses of power that weren't tied to war? It might make us do power differently. And that would be an amazing thing. But so many of our discourses of power are tied to discourses of war because so many of our narratives of war pull in discourses of power. That's what we think power looks like, right? Same with, discourses of leadership and so on. Another example is discourses of knowledge and the intersection between discourses of knowledge and discourses of war. This is something that we can talk about in antiquity or lots of other eras. In Courtney Roby's chapter in our volume, for example, there are certain discourses of knowledge that are about mathematical knowledge, about scientific knowledge, about geometrical knowledge, that the authors of the Greek military manuals really lean into to inform their representation of war as ordered and as clean and actually as ethically okay. Because if you've got discourses of geometry and mathematics, then that associates that kind of war fighting, that kind of battle formation or whatever, with ideas of honesty, with ideas of reliability, with ideas of perfection. And so leaning into discourses of knowledge enables certain narratives of war to depict war in ways that cleanse it, that are very militarizing as well. But in turn, they also might feed, the discourses of war might feed into discourses of knowledge, where knowledge is represented as conquering things. Knowledge cuts through, knowledge empowers, right? So there are lots of discourses of learning and progress and science and technology can be deployed to suggest military superiority, but then in turn reinforce broader ideas of civilization. That then can also be used to suggest that enemies are less civilized and savage and therefore actually deserving of less humane treatment. Environmental discourses of untamed land or treacherous terrain, for example, can be deployed in war storytelling, not only to take the drama up a notch and make it all look more exciting, but to bring in ideas of bravery and strategic cunning on the one hand and deceit or cowardice that's somehow connected to that untamed savage land on the other. And that really inflects how we view all the different actors in that landscape. As I say, then might make certain kinds of behaviours somehow more justifiable or more viable. So those are a few examples of the ways in which we really ought to pay attention to how war stories harness different discourses and how interdiscursivity, the connection between discourses, can have real world implications, can have ramifications for people on the ground.
Absolutely. And thank you for unpacking some of the terminology a little bit. That's really helpful. So you write particularly about connections between discourses of war and discourses of childhood in the book. Those are really interesting places to connect. So can you give us some examples from antiquity that might help us understand their complex interrelationships?
Yeah, so I've been inspired to look at the intersection between discourses of war and childhood by a lot of people who work on experiences of childhood in conflict in modern eras. It's important to say everything I'm talking about for antiquity, the real world impacts of war storytelling, the real world impacts of interdiscursivity is real for us now, right? But so I've been drawing on their expertise, so the expertise of academics like Marshall Bayer, Jana Tabak, Helen Berentz, who've all been on the podcast in the past, and thinking about where do we see children and war together in antiquity. So a couple of really clear examples are in the Iliad, when we see in Book 6, baby Astyanax in the arms of his mother Andromache as she asks Hector not to go back into the fray. And another example is the images that we get of Aeneas' son Ascanius in Virgil's Aeneid. And in both cases, it's really interesting to look at the ways in which the children are imagined in these war stories. And I'm really drawing on a lot of scholarship that other people have pioneered about imagined childhood and the construction of childhood through storytelling. So in the Iliad, Astyanax features very much as not a real person. The characters within the poem, they're not actually interested in Astyanax as an individual, as a human being. He's very much an imagined child. He's a sort of cipher almost. He's not fleshed out in any depth. Instead, he embodies innocence and future possibility, and he is there in the narrative to inject pathos and tragic irony into our picturing, our visualization of the Trojan War and its aftermath. So what happens there is we get this imagined child in the text who helps us visualize war with more pathos. Hecuba, for example, it's not just in the Iliad, in Euripides' Trojan Women, for example, we hear about this too. Characters like Hecuba and Andromache, Astyanax is this hook on which they can hang their laments about war's impacts actually on them, and war's impacts on Hector, war's impacts on Troy. So the imagined child, this embodiment of innocence and youth is this narrative device for characters in the play and for the authors to render the horrors of war more visible and more comprehensible. But there's a flip side to this, which is that cements particular images of childhood as innocent, as sweet, as cute, as agency-less. And so as much as a Steinach's The Child, the imagined child, helps us visualize war, that war story gets us to visualize childhood in very particular ways. And we see that, again, as I say, in the Aeneid, in Virgil's representations of Ascanius. So we see Ascanius in the Aeneid, in Virgil's Aeneid, in a couple of different ways. He appears as the little boy, the young child Iulus, a few times, as this innocent child, a victim of war, holding his daddy's hand as they flee Troy. Very, very cute, and helps Dido, the Queen of Carthage, fall in love with Aeneas, his father, through the intervention of a couple of gods as well. So we see him as a child, as an imagined child, but we also see Ascanius as a teenager who's learning to hunt, who's flexing his military muscles, who's leading a troop of teenagers off to shoot boar, and who's then stepping into the shoes of the warrior, who's starting to lead an actual troop of soldiers, who's becoming a future leader of Rome. So in Virgil's Aeneid, we see Ascanius as an imagined child and as a becoming adult, an adult in waiting, as it were. Actually, we see that tiny bit with Astyanax in the Iliad as well. He never becomes the adult that he could have been because he dies. So Ascanius, again, is this narrative device in the Aeneid, whose childhood and whose teenage years help us look at war in particular ways. But also that war storytelling helps us look at childhood in certain ways. It gets us to look at young children in war as agency-less victims, as people who don't have a voice, who are saved from the flames of Troy, for example, by their father. But it also gets us to look at teenagers as youth, as warriors in waiting. And it's a very militarizing kind of interdiscursivity here. So Virgil leans into discourses of war and childhood to reinforce and shape our understanding of the distinction between childhood and adulthood in ways that socialize children to aspire to war as part of their growing up. That's Ascanius's becoming adult. The becoming adult is synonymous with becoming warrior, and it highly masculinized as well as highly militarized. So these two discourses, these discourses of childhood and war, construct each other. There's a reductive concept of childhood and a reductive concept of youth as well, which visualize both war and children in this cycle, which reinforce each other and have real world effects again. And we know that it's not just an ancient phenomenon, that the ways in which we look at youth as becoming adults can sometimes be very militarizing.
Well, particularly with the heroic father, somebody who has these incredible stories built up around him. And Virgil's created this really enviable path, this sort of projected destiny through the father, that the son would then want to have his part in recreating the experiences and narratives that his father's already done. And that becomes emblematic, obviously, for many Romans as their foundation characters. And they become so important in the iconography of the city as it grows. And they're still so important to us now. Those characters are not forgotten. Obviously, Astyanax is more of a tragic figure. But again, you're quite right to point out that I love the descriptor as a cipher, because he's nothing and he's everything all at once. And one of the most tragic parts of the story. So
tragic, but we learn from the conversation around Astyanax that had he lived, he would have been this warrior that would have been even better and more dangerous than Hector. So again, there's that. And you're right that these ideas of the distinction between childhood and adulthood, as partly, in Virgil, the distinction between being a victim of conflict and being a perpetrator of conflict, these have a socializing impact on readers to this day. And, it might sound hyperbolic in a way that, this is an exaggeration, but it's not. This kind of war storytelling that draws these tight connections between discourses of childhood, adulthood, masculinity and war are deeply embedded in our psyche and have real world consequences.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. Your research underlines the impact in which ancient habits of imagining and describing war influenced how it was experienced and pursued in antiquity. I guess I'd like to ask, do you think these ancient narratives and habits still have influence today in concrete ways? Do you see it as being something that we are living with a lot closer to our consciousness in some way? Like, are we aware of it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think there's something about a sort of Greco-Roman aesthetic or mythology flies under the radar and yet is deeply impactful. So I took you on a little tour of Augustan era Rome earlier, but if we went on a little tour of contemporary London, we'd see a whole pile of war memorials. We'd see a society that is absolutely saturated in military storytelling and war storytelling, and that's not just in the sort of the monumental war memorials, but it might be in the fact that the streets of London actually do have ceremonial soldiers wafting up and down them, for example, the changing of the guard and so on, the beefeaters. And, the postcards you can buy if you're a tourist in London have a fair amount of militaristic imagery on them. And then, you might have a bus that's sort of advertising the latest sort of superhero film on its side or whatever. But one of the features of the monuments in particular is that a lot of them carry a Greco-Roman aesthetic. So the cenotaph in central London to the glorious dead has Roman era laurel wreaths on it. And there are multiple other really big monuments, war memorials, that really hark back to Greco-Roman aesthetics and militarizing iconography and messaging. So yes, it's there, it's flying under the radar, but it's part of our everyday. It's part of our everyday in leisure as well. A lot of people game war, and a lot of people game war through Total Rome or through Greek conflict as well. We absorb a lot of ancient war storytelling through popular film and popular fiction, all of that, the online gaming, quite a lot of the war storytelling from antiquity, not all of it at all, but a fair proportion of it, maintains a kind of emphasis on soldiers, on great commanders, on technology, on empire. Some of it doesn't. Some of it's very much from a different perspective, from women's voices, from enslaved voices, and so on. But there's still a sort of a dominant strand that perpetuates patterns of war storytelling, habits of visualizing war that we derive directly from antiquity. And if you want to think also about a very concrete example, the influence of ancient war narratives on contemporary ideas of gender and masculinity, just go to X or whatever it's called these days and Google Spartan masculinity. And
oh no,
oh my goodness, no, don't. Actually, that's a really bad piece of advice. Don't go and Google Spartan masculinity. But if you did, one of the things that you find is that mythology around the military culture of Sparta is alive and kicking today in discussions of masculinity, toxic masculinity. And it's no accident that people rocked up to the Capitol on the 6th of January 2020 wearing Spartan helmets and carrying Spartan slogans. So yes, so certain habits of imagining and describing war from antiquity are still part of contemporary society and culture. They're in our everyday. We access them through a range of different media, through monuments, through games, through, films, comics, everything. And some of them do problematize antiquity, and some of them problematize some of the things that we've been talking about, but not all of them do. And some of them, like the Spartan masculinity tropes and memes, absolutely lean into mythologized Spartan war fighting in ways that potentially are changing people's behaviors or shaping people's behaviors and mindsets in the real world today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking as well, as somebody who lives in Edinburgh, the neoclassical art and architecture of the city, representative and created to display wealth and control and dominance and education and everything great about elite power, is still so present in the city in all the areas that you kind of imagine, but particularly spaces that construct culture, like museums and galleries, and it's militarizing imagery in spaces that hold paintings, and those paintings are taken from wherever, and that kind of thing. So it's interesting, even when it can be a monument to war, it's also contextualized in a space of beauty, which creates its own problematic feelings as you might look at it.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's a lot of really interesting material there. And it sounds like this edited volume is a call to study ancient warfare differently. And you have so much experience now tapping into different aspects of how people are visualizing warfare, but particularly your expertise with antiquity. What is it you would like to see change in ancient military studies?
So one thing I'd love to see change is much more attention paid to war storytelling. Traditionally, war studies has been about what happened when, historical events, strategy, politics, technology, and realia, historical realia. But one of the things that I hope this book does is really just underline the point that we can only understand warfare, ancient and modern. We can only understand it fully if we understand the stories that we tell about it and the stories that drive it or might mitigate it. Or the study of war storytelling is as important as the study of facts and figures and capabilities and historical events. So that's one thing that I'd really like more attention paid to. War storytelling and its informative influence on how war gets pursued and maybe even prevented. As part of that, I'd like to see a demilitarization of ancient military studies, which sounds like a paradox almost. But I think we can demilitarize ancient military studies. For far too long, ancient military studies has actually been quite militarizing, not just militarized, but it is quite militarizing. It still celebrates weaponry in excited ways. It does talk sometimes unthinkingly in terms of glory and greatness of empire and so on. I don't want to single out anyone individually, and we all fall into these habits of speech, these habits of thought, partly because we're socialized into them from a school age, and that's one place where we really need to start. We need to demilitarize ancient history courses in school, and I'm glad to say that work is underway, in fact, already. So a demilitarization of ancient military studies might involve spending less time on soldiers, less time on actual battle as well. War is much bigger than battle. War is not just about the battlefield. It is about all of the space and all of the time that is impacted by armed violence. So we can demilitarize ancient military studies by choosing actually not to restudy the Battle of Mantinea or the Battle of Marathon or whatever endlessly, but actually think, well, let's critically reconstruct some of the other narratives that we haven't heard about, some of the other experiences that we haven't heard about away from the battlefield and away from the soldiers, women, civilians, more of them. So more of the human front and more marginalized voices and indeed more everyday experiences. Now we need new tools to do that because actually our ancient sources are elite oriented, they're battle oriented, and they're great leader oriented. And so they don't give us very many insights, but we can use tools like critical fabulation, a methodology pioneered by Cedar Hartman to excavate slave voices, for example, in slave histories where slave voices are quite hard to find. And we can use that kind of approach, critical fabulation or useful fiction, the kind of work being done by novelists at the moment, like Natalie Haynes, Pat Barker in The Silence of the Girls and that trilogy, for example, based on evidence to amplify the voices and the experiences of the people who've dropped out of our standard sources and histories of antiquity. And then I would like to see more interest in war's aftermath, conflict resolution, but not just militarized conflict resolution, post-conflict recovery, conflict transformation, what peace and peace building felt like, how they were experienced by ordinary people, not just, this top level treaty making and ceasefire and whatever. And really have a think about how we can revolutionize ancient military studies by really foregrounding ancient peace studies and by thinking about peace imaginaries and ancient discourses and experiences of peace as a way of rethinking what we think we know about ancient experiences and discourses of war.
Excellent. Absolutely. That's wonderful. And just your work, it leads to such interesting thought projects. And there's so many interesting questions left to ask about the material when you just flip the perspective that you're asking the question on. You're doing really cool stuff, and I'm sure listeners will be interested to read the work when it comes out and to get in touch and get involved and just start in your own day-to-day experience of antiquity or modern conflicts, just trying to think about it differently, challenge yourself to that. I mean, I've gained so much insight and really interesting changes to my perspective on these topics just by editing these podcasts. So I've really enjoyed your work and just seeing how it's evolved over time. So Alice, thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I'm sure the listeners will be hungry for episode 2, but to get us started, this has been great and a really wonderful introduction to the antiquity side of the work you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for being the other side of the microphone and asking the questions.
My pleasure. And thank you to our listeners for joining us again. In part 2 of our discussion, we are going to delve deeper into concepts of peace, the emerging field of ancient peace studies that Alice is leading. We will discuss reading against the grain of ancient sources to parse out evidence for peace and peace building, and some multidisciplinary approaches to outreach that her project is currently engaged with. We have more episodes coming up, so stay tuned and make sure that you follow us on social media if you want to see what interesting materials are coming out, any updates on the Visualizing War and Peace project website. So definitely keep tuning in. If you would like to support our project, please do share our podcast with others in your networks. If you would like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media, just search Visualizing War, or get in touch directly by emailing viswar@st-andrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. Show is mixed by me, Zofia. Thank you so much for listening.